been making a lot of progress on the 55 CoyoTBird project. We've got the 5.0 engine installed, the fuel system plumbed, but there's still a bunch of things we got to do to make this car run. The biggest thing that we really have to tackle is the cooling system. Initially, the radiator in the Thunderbird leaned at kind of an odd angle so that Ford could get a larger surface area into such a small engine compartment. The problem with that is it kind of made our room really limited on what to do with an air intake and other plumbing for the steering system and the air conditioning and the condenser. So what we did is we had a custom-made Afco radiator made for this car to our dimensions, and we cut up the core support and we stood the radiator straight up in a more traditional manner than leaning back like Ford had originally intended. This allowed us to get more room in front of the radiator for our AC condenser and to create a space for the intake air box to go so that we'd have a good place for our mass airflow sensor and a straight shot cold air from behind the grill into the motor. Well, we had an extensive conversation with Afco about what we needed this radiator to do. We told them essentially that the car is 412 horsepower and air conditioned, so we wanted to make sure we'd be able to stay cool with the air on. So they designed us an all aluminum radiator that's got a 4-inch core and essentially fits the same size core into a smaller space because we no longer have tanks on top and bottom of this radiator. The tanks are on the side, and the tanks are a little bit narrower than they would usually be for a radiator this typical size. One of the other things we did to ensure proper airflow to the radiator was modifying the lower air dam. The air dam originally was designed to funnel air towards the radiator as the car goes down the road. But since we moved the position of the radiator, it wasn't going to funnel air to the entire core. So Nick took the time to cut and modify the air dam so it would funnel air to the radiator in its new position. One of the problems with putting the Coyote motor into an older car is the radiator hose connections are designed for quick connects. The quick connect hoses that fit it for the Mustang obviously don't fit a 55 Thunderbird. So what we did is we took a file and we carefully cut the quick connect bosses off of the plastic tubes so that a traditional radiator hose and clamp would slip over them and work like any other hose should. Air intake system for the 55 Thunderbird is part of the reason we moved the radiator, is we needed a good place to get cold fresh air for the engine, and the airbox that Ford sends with the Coyote motor is straight out of the Mustang. So it's big and bulky and it's meant to go behind the headlight, and with the small engine bay we just didn't have that option. So we custom designed an airbox to fit over and in front of the radiator. That gives us good cold air for the engine for maximum power, and it looks a lot better than the Ford system that came with the motor. We were able to design an airbox with a filter that's readily available off the shelf. I think the air filter we used is actually for a 2009 diesel Jetta. The air intake tube has a couple other connections that you have to make for the engine to run, and we essentially used the Ford box as our template. We took the mass airflow sensor out and made a new boss in our new intake tube. And there's also the fresh air breather for the positive crankcase ventilation system that has to attach to it so that the air that's pulled through the engine is clean and fresh and you don't get dirt introduced into the oil. One of the problems with mounting the radiator lower than the engine is that it's hard to fill the cooling system because the cap is obviously below the water line in the engine. To get around this, we followed Ford's lead and we used an expansion tank up on the fender well. This raises the water level to the same height as the motor, and then where the steam tube used to go to the expansion tank on the Mustang, we removed that and we put a bleeder screw in there so that we can get the last bit of air out of the engine while it's running. There's two other tanks that you'll see on the passenger fender well of the CoyoTBird. One is the washer fluid reservoir, and the other one up to the front is the power steering reservoir. The power steering system got kind of complicated on this car because the only place to put the pump is on the right side of the motor, but all the connections for the power steering are on the left side of the car. The reason we put the power steering tank there is there's only one place really to put the power steering pump on the Coyote, and that's on the passenger side. So the tank's close to the pump and above it so that the fluid feeds into it. And that also gave us the opportunity to run most of the lines and hoses behind the header panel and through the inner fender on the driver's side so that it's as clean as possible for as far as the power steering hoses have to go in the car. Once we had all the vital systems put together for the motor itself, we turned our attention to the interior of the car. And the first problem is the tack. Somebody had put a Autometer tack in the original housing, and they did a really bad job of it. The needle was hitting the glass and it wouldn't have worked, and it didn't even look right for the car. So what we did is we went to Autometer with their Custom Shop program and used an online design tool to design a tack that looked as close to what would have been in the 55 as possible. Using the Autometer Custom Shop program is pretty simple. The first thing you do is you pick your gauge. In our case, it was a tachometer, and then you pick the size that you want. After that, you've got a choice of the bezels, and this program essentially lets you use bits and pieces from any of the Autometer products that are available. So we chose the classic chrome bezel. Next thing you choose is your glass. You've got flat or domed. We went with a flat glass, similar to the original tack. Then you've got your background color, which obviously need to be black for this car. And then you get to choose your pointer. So we went with a classic pointer. It looks similar to what the clock pointer is. It's not exactly the same, but I think it'll fool most people. And lastly, you pick your font and its color, and then the ticking and its color. So by the time you're done, you can choose essentially bits and pieces that really make an Autometer gauge that looks as correct as possible in your car. Once we had all the vital systems for the engine complete and our gauges put together, it was time to do the fun part and start the car for the first time. And with the Coyote's control system, pretty much as long as you got fuel pressure and you got power to the starter, it'll light right off. And in our case, it did that just fine. And once we were done with that, it was time to take it all apart and paint everything so we could put it back together with a final coat of paint and everything looking nice. There's so much custom work involved in making this engine and brakes and the steering system work in this car that we decided to put everything together in bare steel and bare aluminum and make sure everything worked, all the holes were drilled, lines routed, wiring done, so that we could take it apart and paint everything and just put it right back together. The Thunderbird's body is unique to most cars in that it's pretty much one piece from the header panel to the tail pan. The front fenders are welded to the car at the factory, and then all the seams are leaded over, so there's no good way to take the car apart, which makes it a challenge to put it on a rotisserie. And we'll show you how we did that next time.